Okay, so welcome everyone to our 12th Edible Gardening Series webinar. My name is Sarah Bostic, and I'm the Sustainable Agriculture Extension Agent with the University of Florida in both Sarasota and DeSoto counties down here on the southwest coast of Florida. And I am joined today with two of my fantastic coworkers, Carol Wyatt Evans, who is the Chemicals and the Environment Agent, and she and I take turns teaching these classes. We're also joined today by Mindy Hannock, who is the School and Community Gardens Coordinator for Sarasota County Extension Office. Mindy has the task of monitoring and moderating that chat box, which we appreciate enormously, because that chat box is exactly how we're going to ask you to ask your questions today. We are expecting a big group. We had close to 200 people who registered, and we usually get about 50% of the people who registered actually attending. So the easiest way to keep things flowing is to just go ahead and start typing whatever questions you might have right into that chat box, and Mindy will organize them. So here we go. Today's topic is starting seedlings at home. And the three of us really got inspired to start this series because we hear from folks all the time that they're really struggling with some of the basics of how to grow things, especially in Florida. But in general, we hear from people from all over the place who are just trying to figure out how, just like the best practices of growing edible gardens. So if you have missed any of the previous sessions and like to tap into them, we will be sending out links later this week that will give you a link to the previous 11 sessions that we've done. So here we go. So we try and generally fail to cram every topic into 10 minutes because Carol and I both have a lot to say about all of these things that we talk about. And the same certainly goes for the topic of starting seeds at home. So this little picture of a little seedling coming up in a crack between two boards, right? We see this all the time. We see seedlings growing in the strangest, most difficult environments, doing really well and thriving. And for some reason, that doesn't translate very well into successfully growing seedlings at home. It's actually really hard to be really spot on and successfully grow seedlings at home. So some of the things that you really have to pay attention to are temperature, light, the type of soil that you're using, the type of container that you're starting those seedlings in, the amount of water, frequency of water, same with fertilizer, and then things like air movement. Turns out air movement is actually quite important. And then managing for pests and diseases, and then simply just timing, making sure you're starting things at the right time. So I'm going to start kind of at the very beginning, which is what kind of soil you're using to start your seeds. And in general, it's actually pretty important if you're growing inside to start with something that is kind of like a sterile growing medium of some sort, AKA don't dig up some soil from your backyard. Actually start with something that's intended to be potting soil. And that's mostly because that gives the plant, the little seedlings you're growing in the artificial environment of your home, the best chance to get started. If you start with your soil from the backyard, they'll start with a lot of potential pests and diseases right there in their potting mix. So in general, you want to start with something that is either labeled as seed starting mix or germination mix. There's a few other types of names that go along with potting soils, but in general, you want something that directly references seeds or germination. In general, a really fine texture. Things that are labeled as potting mixes are generally too rough or too coarse for a lot of the seeds that you'd want to start at home. So you can see in this mix, it's kind of a mixture of fine and coarse. So for starting something like cucumbers or sunflowers inside, this is fine. But for starting something that has really tiny seeds, it's actually too rough of a mix. And a lot of mixes actually have some amount of fertilizer built right into them. So you may not actually really need to provide any amount of fertilizer when you're getting going. So definitely read that bag before you add anything else to it. So there's so many different kinds of containers you can use for starting plants at home. The picture that you see on your screen, that's a really typical kind of seedling tray that farms use to start their seedlings. In general, that's, unless you're growing a lot of seedlings, it's generally not what you'd use for a home garden, because most of them have between 36 and 512 little cells or little blocks where those plants can grow. But if you really are growing a whole lot of seedlings, it may be worth buying a few trays. It can be a really easy, really patterned way to start things. But you can really start things in any kind of container you have, right? There's ways to use old newspaper to turn them into little biodegradable pots. You can use other plant pots. You can use little things made out of paper towel rolls or little egg cups. There's so many different things you can start your seedlings in. This is a product. I have no idea what brand this is. It's just a generic picture to illustrate the point, but the types of pots that are made out of things like peat moss or compressed manure can be great to start your seedlings in, with the caveat that they tend to dry out very, very quickly. They just know that going into it, they're not going to hold water very well. So you'll have to just pay more attention to how much water those plants need, more so than with other types of material. Some folks really like to just start one seed per small pot. Both of these pictures show tomatoes. And in one of these pictures, the person who's planting them started with just one seed per pot for each tomato. That's great. That works wonderfully. You can also start with sprinkling lots of seeds into a single pot. And then a little bit later, when they have a couple of leaves on them, actually pull those apart and transplant them out into individual pots. So a lot of people like to start with small pots with lots of seeds, just because it's a more condensed place to start your seedlings. And if they don't all germinate, you don't have some random empty pots sitting around. So this is a picture just to illustrate what overseeding can do. These are seedlings, some sort of like kale or cabbage, that were intentionally seeded very, very densely, actually, to produce microgreens. But I just wanted to show you this picture because this is a great picture of what happens when you have a whole bunch of seeds together in a very small space. Their root system actually turns into pretty much a solid mass, like you can see here. The white part around the bottom of the plants is actually a solid mat of roots. You can't untangle roots that have gotten very, very mixed together. So it'll really damage those roots. You'll probably damage the plant also. So if you are planting in just one pot and then separating seeds later, it's still important to give each seed a little bit of space in that pot. And then just remember, the amount of root that's growing below ground is really similar to the amount of plant that you can see above ground. And why that's important is that it's really a good idea to match the size of the plant to the size container that you're ultimately growing them in. So making sure that there's going to be enough space for that root system to actually develop in whatever you're growing it in, so that when you transplant it, it has a developed root system. So it doesn't become so shocked that it just dies when you transplant it. Okay, so shifting over to the next small topic, and I know this is a total whirlwind. This is a topic that normally I would teach in 2 hours instead of 10 or 20 minutes. So I'm going to try to just kind of cram together some of the most key points. So it's really important to know that seeds actually contain all the nutrients and energy a plant needs to start its life. They don't actually need supplemental fertilizer of any sort when they're just getting going. And so there's a term that I want to throw out there that is, it's a science term. It's called cotyledon. So a cotyledon is basically when a seed is tightly curled up, or a plant is tightly curled up in its seed, it's encapsulated by this thing called a cotyledon, which to untrained eyes looks very much like a leaf, but it's actually not. So this is a cucumber plant coming up. And these we usually think of as the first leaves that have come out. That's actually the cotyledon part of the plant. This leaf that you can see here coming up, that is actually the first true leaves that the plant is producing. So before the plant has true leaves that are developing, that plant is getting absolutely everything it needs directly from what's left of the seed and from the sun. So, in the very beginning, you really don't need to give plants anything supplemental. This is another great way to see the difference between a cotyledon and a leaf. This is a cilantro plant. Where's my pointer? There we go. This part is the cotyledon on both sides. So that part you can actually see coming out of the seed. You can see the two parts of the cotyledon right here. And then eventually it starts to grow its first true leaves. So in most plants, the cotyledon looks pretty different than the first true leaves. Okay, so watering. Watering is so hard to to really nail the fine art of watering, especially when plants are really small. It's generally good to water from the bottom. So actually, instead of pouring water into the top of a container, to have the container in some sort of, or whatever kind of container you're growing plants in, to have some sort of dish or tray underneath them, and to just pour some water into that dish or tray. And the plant has gotten enough water when you can actually start to see the moisture at the surface of the soil. If the surface of the soil looks really, really soggy, you've given it too much, and you'll probably need to prop it up out of whatever container it's sitting in to let some of that water drain off. And just remember, when seedlings are tiny, they're really tiny, and their roots and their veins and their capacity to handle water is also just really tiny. So you may just have to be giving those plants small amounts of water fairly frequently. And then once they develop enough to need fertilizer, same goes with fertilizer. They just can't actually handle a whole lot of it at any given time. So to me, one of the absolute trickiest parts about starting seeds at home is giving those seeds sufficient light. It's really, really hard to give seedlings as much light as they need if you're growing them fully inside. We're going to have a session, I think, in a couple of weeks on growing plants in your lanai. Sometimes a lanai can be an easier place to start seedlings than inside of your house. So if you see seedlings that are arcing like this and are really long and kind of leggy, you can see them here too. They're really long, stretching, leggy. That is a very concrete signal that your plants are not getting enough light. Those plants are going to be nutrient deficient, they're going to be weak, and they're going to be pretty brittle. So when you move them outside, they can actually snap in wind or snap by getting brushed against. So those are plants that you can see in those two pictures that really need access to more light. Some folks that are really committed to growing seedlings at home actually will move seedlings from south-facing window during that part of the day where it's getting full light over to an east or a west-facing window later in the day, so that you literally may have to carry your plants around to different windows so that they get enough light. Another option is simply to invest in some grow lights. There's a huge spectrum on the market of grow lights. Some of them are really inexpensive. Some of them are extremely expensive. You definitely do not need to sink a lot of money into grow lights. But grow lights can be so helpful. I know people who have actually grown all of their seedlings for a farm in a different state in a basement that has no light in it whatsoever. And that's how they started their small scale vegetable farm, was with grow lights in a windowless basement. So it basically means that your plants can always get as much light as they need, regardless of where you put them in the house. So that's just another picture of a seedling. This is a kale seedling that is very much not getting enough light. Seedlings should never be that long and leggy. They should be pretty short and stocky. So this is a plant that clearly needs more light. It also needs some air movement. Plants, before you put plants outside, you need to go through this process called hardening off. And part of hardening off is making sure that the plants aren't going to go through a total shock when you take them from the nice, calm, gentle environment of your home out into the wilds of your garden. And so you can actually take your hand or like a small paintbrush or a pencil or a skewer and just brush over the top of plants, especially plants that are looking leggy. This will simulate wind, the wind that they're going to experience when they go outside, and it will help those plants actually toughen up and become stockier, which is a really good thing. Doesn't sound like a good thing, but it's a very good thing. You can also simply just put a fan on occasionally in whatever space you are growing your indoor seedlings in. That's a totally viable way to get those plants to get a little stocky. So hardening off is that idea of making sure your plants are actually ready to go outside. It's a really drastic change. Like think about taking, like a human infant from a hospital and then just plonking them outside, right? It's a pretty drastic change in life. So the process of hardening off usually happens in stages. I usually like to harden my plants off over the course of about 10 days or so, where every day I'll leave them outside for a little bit longer, and then I'll bring them back in. And eventually, for the last 2 or 3 days, I leave them outside really close to wherever they're actually going to be growing, or even in the garden bed they're going to be growing in, for 24 hours a day for 2 to 3 days, so that they get used to the exact environment they're going to go in before you remove them from their pot and send them on their way into the ground. And last but not least, sometimes things just don't go quite as planned when you're growing seedlings. And if for any reason you do end up with seedlings that have some disease, or they're damaged, they're looking not quite so hot, it is unfortunately a much better idea to just say goodbye to those seedlings and start over again. If you start with diseased seedlings, those plants really won't ever thrive, and they will likely spread whatever disease they have onto other plants in your garden. Some of those diseases end up actually living and surviving quite happily in your soil for many years, and will just continue a cycle of reinfecting plants. So if you happen to have a sad experience with growing seedlings and you have plants that look anything like this, it's actually a good thing to just let them go. So that's what I've got for you today. That was a really quick run through. Thank you all so very much, and hope that you have a beautiful rest of your week.